In this summary presentation, we will look at both chapters 8 and 9 in our text. These two chapters are a bit smaller from a content perspective. Chapter 8 will address managing risks. We will begin by looking at the technique shown in the textbook. Please read chapter 8 to get more information on the methodology that I will overview in this presentation. But I'm also going to add to what the textbook shows by presenting a second, what I consider more capable methodology of managing risk. It's based on some government standards used in government contracts, and it is far more quantitative, where the textbook's method is far more qualitative. Chapter 9 will then address closing out the project. Make sure you read chapter 9, but the summary of chapter 9 will be fairly brief because I'll just kind of hit the big picture of the things that need to be considered as you close out the project. We will begin by talking about risk management at a very high level. Then we will introduce the two techniques. We should begin by talking about what risk really means in this context. When we say risk, we're really talking about any unwanted circumstance. That could be an overage on cost, or maybe unavailability of some piece of equipment that is needed on the project, or an individual becomes ill that's on the project. It could also be delays due to weather, delays due to permitting, you name it. Anything that is an unwanted circumstance that's going to impact the baseline plan. Your textbook will talk about many different types of risks. I will let you get that information from the text, but just understand that we're talking about risks at a rather high level. Managing risk really ultimately comes to the project manager. So this is something that you as the project manager will need to deal with primarily. Certainly the people working for you and the leaders on sub-activities or work packets, those individuals need to be aware of what's happening. They need to report promptly to you what's happening in order to allow you to more effectively manage the risk. But often risk management needs to happen at a bit higher level. If you try to do it too low, the interaction of risks and the cascading effect of what a risk can turn into is lost. So this is really primarily the project manager's responsibility to take seriously and to plan for. Remember, if you don't plan to succeed, you're really planning to fail. This requires a methodology. Now, that methodology is going to fall into four broad categories. First, we have to identify what types of risks we're even talking about. This can be a challenging activity as to what types of unforeseen events might impact your project. Obviously, since they're unforeseen, that makes it a bit more difficult to know what they are. This comes with experience, pulling from past projects, understanding what has happened in the past, constantly learning from other project managers, reading project management literature in order to stay familiar with what's happening on other projects, and just keeping an open mind as to the types of things that can occur. Once those risks are identified, then there needs to be an assessment portion where you look at the probability and the severity of each one of those unforeseen possibilities. This is where our two methods, the book's method and the method I will add, really differ on how you do this assessment. And so we will look at both of those on subsequent slides. Once you have the risks identified and the risks assessed from a probability and severity point of view, then there needs to be a plan that will be initiated at a particular point. Once indicators happen as to this unforeseen event is actually likely to now occur because we're seeing certain pieces of evidence appear, we need to have a plan in place to act. You don't want to start planning your actions once you see that the event is happening. You need to have a plan in place and be ready to trigger that once the plan happens. Again, we will look at the examples on subsequent slides to make this a bit more clear. And then we go into a monitoring process. Once we have the risks identified, the assessment understood of each risk, and a plan in place, essentially, as we've talked about in past situations, we just cycle through this. Okay, so we just continue to cycle around and we continue to loop through this process on a periodic basis so that we continue to watch for evidence that the risks are occurring, possibly adding additional risks if new insights come in. And if we do add additional risks, we assess those risks at the time that we add them in order to keep our risk plan up to date as much as possible. On this slide is shown the methodology used in the textbook. This is not a bad methodology. Please don't hear me to say that. It is simply a qualitative methodology, meaning that there's not a lot of hard data or hard numbers behind this particular technique. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It can still be a very useful technique, but just simply understand the limitations. Shown is what's known as the risk table, or the risk assessment table that's associated with the ideas that have been quantified. Now, on a real project, you would have many risks. I've seen projects with as many as 30, 40, 50 risks that have been identified, assessed, and plans put in place for them. Here we have a much smaller example to fit on the slide. This is shown in your textbook, but this small example is sufficient to document the process. So we have two risks shown here. We have the risk of rain or a weather delay happening on the event, and if that occurs, we're trying to do an outside event, the weather could impact things, we need to realize that this risk can occur. May not occur, can occur. Okay, what is the impact? Once we understand the risk, we need to think about the impact. The impact of this would be lower attendance. If this is an outside event yet the weather is bad, then there's going to be an impact associated with it, low attendance, and possible loss of financial value on the part of us, the project manager and the project team. Because if we have already purchased expecting a large crowd and then we have a smaller crowd, we have a loss on the project due to this unforeseen event of bad weather. Okay, now before we move on, think about our second risk. We also have the possibility of transportation issues occurring that might impact individuals getting to our event. So again, this could reduce the attendance and thereby reduce the revenue from the event if this is, again, impacting how many people will attend. Okay, so we have two events here. One is due to weather events, environmental events. One is due to other individuals, but individuals we can't control and that we may or may not be able to have any influence over, doing something in their work scope that impacts our work scope. Once we have identified the risks and thought about the impact, we need to decide how significant of a risk is this. And there are two factors we look at. We look at the likelihood of it occurring, or the probability of the event, and we look at how bad it would be if it happened. Now, this is where the book's technique becomes a bit more qualitative. What the book recommends is simply a low, medium, high. So there's a low probability of occurrence, medium probability of occurrence, high probability of occurrence. Those are obviously very relative scales, very qualitative scales. There's no firm delineation between what's a low and what's a medium and what's a high. Again, doesn't mean it's bad, it just means you need to recognize the technique. So, in this example, the team has assessed the rain risk as a medium likelihood of occurring due to this part of the country that this particular event is in and the season that it's in. But if rain happens, it would actually have a high impact. It would be a rather significant thing. This is an outdoor event. There's probably audio equipment and things like that and lighting equipment necessary at the event. If there's rain, that can't be exposed to the inclement weather, so it would really cause a lot of problems. So the impact is really high. Okay. With that knowledge, we then put together some type of a plan of what we would do if this were to occur. The plan is to have an alternative location, reserve an indoor space that could be used for the event rather than the outdoor place. We would then need to adjust based on the use of the indoor space to still allow the activities to happen. So therefore, we would need to develop a plan for how the indoor space would be utilized and put together extra volunteer work that could mobilize quickly in order to move the event from outdoor to indoor. This does no good, however, if you don't know when to essentially pull the trigger. At what point are you going to decide we are moving? We are going to cancel the outdoor venue and we are going to move to the reserved indoor venue. That's where the action plan comes in. So here, the decision has been made. They will look at the forecast 2 days before the event. Typically, the forecasts are reasonably accurate for a 48-hour duration. So they've decided that is a good time to look, and it still allows them 2 days, 48 hours, which they believe to be sufficient to make the move. That's the other part of this you have to keep in mind. If you wait too long to make the decision, you may not be able to respond due to the amount of work necessary. And just as important as the trigger event is the person who gets to make the decision. In this case, Laura has the responsibility of monitoring the weather and making that call. There is a single point of responsibility. Who's going to take ownership? Who's going to do it? That's really important because otherwise everyone on the team will think it's somebody else's responsibility to manage that activity, that risk. Likewise, the other risk that we have on this project, they give it a high likelihood of occurrence. This must be in a metropolitan area that constantly has road construction, constantly has things going on that are typical, and so therefore they are planning on road construction being a very high likelihood of occurrence, and it could be very detrimental to the activity. Therefore, they are going to plan alternative routes up front, and they're going to have signage ready and be prepared to adjust the transportation instructions at the last minute. They will monitor what the highway department is doing, their construction schedule. Typically, highway departments do publish something, and they will monitor that in order to decide when they need to send out new instructions, new route information to reach the event, and Allison will have that responsibility. So this is not a complicated technique. The book's approach, what I'm calling System 1, is not complicated. The only part of this I don't like is that it's so qualitative. Low, medium, and high tends to be a pretty relative scale. The second technique is based upon the military standard 882E. So this is going to be used on a lot of military and government contracts. And there are slight variations of this, by the way. This isn't the only military standard for risk assessment, but it's one that I have used and am somewhat familiar with. In this particular risk assessment methodology, you have a risk matrix, not just a risk table. You would still have some aspects of the risk table. For instance, the plan, the action plan, and who is going to be responsible for making the decision. That part might still exist. But that center section of the risk table where you decide high occurrence high impact or high severity, you will replace that portion of the table with a matrix. And the matrix gives you far more quantitative resolution and information about what's happening. So the two axes of the matrix, you have severity along the top here, and severity can be negligible, marginal, critical, all the way to catastrophic. We also have probability, all the way from it's completely eliminated, in other words, steps have been taken in order to eliminate the possibility of this occurring, to improbable, remote, occasional, probable, all the way up to frequent. You will therefore need two decisions again to assess the overall impact and probability of the risk. That is exactly the same as in the earlier technique. But on the earlier technique, we just had high, medium, low. Here we have a finer scale, and on the next slide, we're going to add detail to those. The important point is there are standards that exist for how you make these decisions. There are standards of what catastrophic means versus marginal. And we're going to look at those on the next slide. It's also important to understand that the matrix helps you realize how things interconnect. If you have a catastrophic severity that's very likely to happen, so frequent occurrence, obviously that's a horrible place to be. You're up here in the red part of the risk matrix. You never want to be in that. That needs to trigger in your mind as the project manager that something needs to be done to alter this reality that you're living in, because this is just a risky place to be. However, if you have a very catastrophic event, but it is very improbable that it's going to happen, well, that's medium risk. Yes, it's still medium, it's not low, because the damage could be catastrophic. But due to the probability being improbable, it's not nearly as alarming as if you're up here in this red. So it gives you a bit more of an understanding of how you need to focus your attention and which risks perhaps need to be monitored far more closely than other risks. That's part of what I like about this matrix approach. Ideally, you want to be in the blue and the green on everything. This is where you want to be. Either eliminate the risk or be in the low category. Even medium is a bit nervous. Anything in the orange or red, that requires significant attention on the part of the project manager. Now let's look at the next slide that's going to give a lot more information about how you assess the severity and how you assess the probability of occurrence. Recall from the prior slide that this is called the Military Standard 882E. So if you want to go online and Google this information, it is publicly available if these slides aren't quite as clear, perhaps to read as you would like. But here on this slide, we have two tables that are going to help us make these determinations. The top table is focusing on severity. Notice that should be note, not. Sorry, typo in the slides. I'll try to fix that in the future. Note the link to consequences. We're going to look at the consequences of the risk event happening in order to determine the severity score. So, what does negligible mean? If you look down here, negligible means that it could result in injury or occupational illness, but that injury or occupational illness would be so slight that it would not result in the loss of a full workday. Or it could be associated with minimal environmental impact, so something that would have to be cleaned up but no significant permanent impact, or monetary losses less than $100,000. Now that one we need to kind of talk about a little bit. Remember that this is being used on military standard projects, and so something like a weapon system or a military base or a military installation or a communication system runs into the millions of dollars. So therefore, from their perspective, a loss of less than $100,000 is not considered large. If, however, you're managing a project that is planning a class reunion or planning a conference event or something like that, the entire budget of the project might be on the order of $50,000 to $100,000. Therefore, a monetary loss, let me make that larger so that we can see it better. A monetary loss there of $100,000 would be significant. So that part of this methodology you might want to reassess. I would basically, in my mind, what I would do here, my recommendation to you would be to think of this monetary value as something like, say, less than 5 to 10% of the project budget, of the total budgeted cost of the project. If it's less than 5 to 10%, then it is not huge, okay? This one up here is approaching the full TBC or more, so perhaps greater than the TBC of the entire project. Okay, that's a significant risk financially. You'll have to be a little bit open to what that means in your project. Okay, let's keep going here. So we have marginal. Marginal, you notice, is an injury or occurrence that results in loss of one or more workdays, but typically on the order of a handful of workdays. Reversible moderate environmental impact. So in other words, there may be some money necessary to reverse it, but it is reversible. Critical now is a more significant injury. Permanent partial disability, injury, or occupational illness that would result in hospitalization or at least 3 personnel injuries, okay? Hospitalization of at least 3 personnel injuries. So more than one person is involved here. I misspoke there a little bit. So more than one person involved. You have reversible significant environmental impact. So it's still reversible, but now the cost is going to be significant because this is a big cleanup. And you notice that the financial amount is growing very large, $1 to $10 million. Finally, catastrophic, anything that can result in the loss of life or total disability. If it's an irreversible environmental impact, something that you could not reverse or you don't know how to reverse it, that automatically falls into the catastrophic category. And obviously, that type of a severity can have massive financial impact associated with it. Loss of a life can result in major lawsuits, major impact on the company, major loss of reputation. So it's hard to even get to a monetary figure sometimes, but in this standard, they're saying exceeding 10 million. Okay, that's the severity. Again, there's a bit of qualitative to it because you have to make the judgment yourself. Well, could this result in death or could it not? So there's a bit of a qualitative assessment, but it gives you a metric to go by. Down here in the probability scale, you'll note that there's an emphasis on the number of occurrences. The number of occurrences. So what we're going to have here is everything from eliminated, which means it's impossible for it to happen, all the way up to frequent, which means it's likely to occur often in the life of the item or life of the project, if you want to think of it that way. So in other words, I'm expecting this to happen multiple times during the project. So for instance, if you have a 6-month project and you have 30 people working for you, you should expect illness to occur multiple times during that time period. You should expect multiple people to be out on vacation or sick leave during that time period. It would be unrealistic to expect otherwise. So this gives you a bit of a scale in order to think about it. Now this is on an individual project item. This is if you're talking in terms of a larger scale where you're looking at like multiple projects. Maybe you're the project manager of project managers, so you're looking at risk more corporate wide, the entire fleet or the entire inventory of your company. But the concepts are the same. What I really like about this is the lower end of the scale. So it's tempting to say, well, that's probably not going to happen. It's improbable. Well, improbable means it's so unlikely it can be assumed occurrence may not be experienced at all in the life of the project. So in other words, it is very reasonable for you to assume that it will not occur, period, ever in your project. If you can't convince yourself of that, then don't consider it improbable. It's going to be at least remote. Remote means it's still unlikely, but it's possible to occur in the life of the project. It is possible. So this kind of moves us away from improbable unless we really have a good reason to believe that strongly that it's improbable. So we're now going to transition to our discussion of Chapter 9 and terminating the project. As a final note on risk management, I would encourage you to consider both techniques valid, but select your technique to be appropriate with the project. If you're doing a smaller project, shorter duration, smaller budget, I think the book's technique is still sufficient. It has all the components necessary. It has assessment of the risk, identification of the risk, trigger event listed, and action plan listed. Those are the big ticket items. So it's sufficient for a smaller project. However, when you're starting to work on larger projects that are spanning months, if not years, that have budgets going into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and you're dealing with lots of individuals, the book's technique to me is simply not rigorous enough. That's when moving to a more quantitative risk matrix approach is appropriate. So I'm not saying either one is necessarily better, they just serve different roles for different projects. Now let's focus on terminating the project. I should begin by saying that there are two ways projects terminate. Sometimes projects terminate naturally, and we expect that, and it should be planned. Sometimes projects terminate unexpectedly due to things beyond our control or events that were completely unforeseen. We're talking more here about the natural termination of a project. Now, in the unforeseen termination, many of these things still have to happen, and I will try to flag those. But as you will be able to see as we talk through this list, we're talking about the planned termination, the expected termination. Now, I do want to point out that this will be our only slide for Chapter 9. I know that seems a little odd, but this one slide captures the big picture of terminating the project in enough detail to guide you as you read the chapter. Please read the chapter for the details, but this will give you the overview and the map of what we're going to be talking about. Okay, let's talk through the pieces here. First of all, termination of the project begins with the project. Now that sounds weird, that we start terminating on the first day of the project, but in a way you do, because you plan the termination activities into the baseline plan. Remember, the baseline plan is primarily focused on your network diagram that shows the interrelation of activities, the duration of activities, the timing of activities, and the responsibility of activities. All of the activities necessary to terminate should be a part of that network diagram. So from the very beginning, you should be planning this. This is not something you just tack on to the end of the project. It should be a part of the plan. With that in mind, this needs to be something that is agreed to, at least in part, with the customer. There will be certain deliverables due upon completion of the project. The customer needs to be in agreement as to the list of those deliverables, when they will be provided, how they will be provided, and to whom they will be provided. That needs to be determined up front at the very beginning and be part of the plan. If not, it can really lead to some unforeseen and unexpected last-minute work that can really delay completion. Okay, so plan early. Now, documentation is a key part of this. We're going to have to document everything that we do. This is the part of most projects that people don't like. I'm an engineer by nature. I work with engineers, and the project management experience that I have over the past 25 to 30 years have all been engineering-related projects. Engineers are notorious for not wanting to do documentation. They want to work on the projects, they want to do experiments, they want to do design, but they don't like writing documentation. But the documentation is absolutely critical. And it needs to be filed appropriately to the correct places and individuals. That means company archives so that it can be brought up later. It may mean to the customer themselves in certain forms. Some documents, however, though, will not go to the customer. There will be portions of the project documentation that are only for the project team and the project team's company. They're proprietary. This will take different forms in different organizations. I worked for a while with Sandia National Laboratories. That was a research facility located in New Mexico, and all the full-time staff had to maintain logbooks of our experimental work, of our calculations, of our design work. That's a very typical practice of scientists and engineers, to maintain a logbook. It's just a handwritten book. But what was not perhaps routine is that those logbooks belong to the National Lab. So upon completion of a logbook, that logbook would go into the library archive of the lab, and other people could check out your lab notes. It became a resource available to everybody. Now, if you needed to see your old lab notes, you could check out your own lab notes again, but it would become an archive for the company. They did that in order to maintain a record of work and to not lose value due to a lack of communication. So, project-related documentation, key. The book will detail a little bit more about that, but just understand how important it is. Now, there's financial implications here too. You need to assure that all payments have been collected from the customer and that all payments have been sent out by you, the project team, for material, subcontractors, and other related items. So, have all the payments been processed? Now, there's sometimes a delay in this. Many companies will have policies where upon receipt of a bill, they have 30 days or 60 days, sometimes even as much as 90 days to provide that payment. So there is a bit of follow-up work required by the project manager or someone tasked with this responsibility by the project manager to make sure all the payments are processed. You can't just assume it happens. It takes effort. Okay? You need to prepare evaluations of your project team. Now, each company will have a formal process for this, and sometimes it doesn't occur on every single project, but I think it's best if it does. If you're in an organization where you may work on 3 or 4 different project teams a year with different project managers in each of those situations, it's great for you to receive feedback from each one of those project managers because each person will have different insights and different observations as to your strengths and weaknesses. And I would like to encourage you to view performance evaluations as an opportunity. They can be a little scary. None of us like to be evaluated, but it is a healthy way to improve yourself. If you don't receive feedback, it's hard to know how to improve. You will have to work within the culture of your company on this one, however. Now, if you own your own company or if you're starting your own project organization, then you get to define these rules, and you need to think seriously about how team assessments and individual assessments are going to be done. But if you're working for a company, you're probably going to have to comply with what the company requires. Just be aware that you, as the project manager, have this responsibility. I currently have several employees working for me, and I am responsible for evaluating them annually and their performance annually. And that's my responsibility. Failure to do that would be poor reflection on me, and that's what the text is trying to get across here. As project manager, you have this responsibility. You will also want to do an evaluation of the project itself. So this is often handled in terms of a meeting. You could do it yourself, but often it's best if you have other individuals involved. Basically a wrap-up, a sunset meeting, a post-project meeting, where you get everyone together for one last time and you document what went well, what did not go well, what could be done better next time, how can we improve. And the book talks about the fact that this can be done somewhat at an internal individual level or an internal team level. That will be appropriate or dependent upon the nature of the project. You will have to decide that. Last but certainly not least, if you have a defined, distinct customer, or 1, 2, 3 defined, distinct customers, it's always a good idea to assess their satisfaction with the project. This is often done through either a face-to-face meeting with them or some type of a written survey, some type of an opinion or feedback survey to allow them to tell you what went well, what did not go well, and how you could improve, what they would have liked to have seen done differently. It has been my experience that, again, these are somewhat scary. People tend to point out things they don't like more than they applaud things that they do like. It's just human nature. So often when you ask a customer their opinion, their feedback on how the project went, you may get more things that you should have done differently or things you could improve upon than things that you did good on. That's okay. Just recognize that it's all valuable information and that all of it can be used to improve yourself as a project manager. Okay, make sure you read chapters 8 and 9. These have been high-level overviews of them. These are both short chapters. Take the time to read them, and as you have questions, please let me know.